20 years after suffering its greatest crisis in history, British genre cinema has exploded onto screens across the world like a once dormant volcano suddenly reborn. The comeback began nearly 10 years ago, led by a gang of cinematic criminals, counting Edgar Wright, Chris Smith, Neil Marshall, and Joe Cornish amongst their ranks, inspired by Danny Boyle, Guy Ritchie, and Matthew Vaughn. This new breed of outlaws now reigns supreme, continually defying the conventions of British-made genre cinema.
Genre movies are always looked as the bad seed of movies.
And they suck you into their worlds and they leave you 90 minutes later.
The English middle and upper classes don't go to the cinema.
We still have a massive catch-up to do on our own domestic market.
Ask any politician the last time they went to the cinema here, the royal family. It's not something they do.
But young people still like that shit.
The British film business has finally reached the point of saying, let's try and make films that are commercial and speak to an audience.
We're no longer a country that just makes butler movies and kitchen sink dramas.
I love killing people and getting killed. I love it. I don't know why. Instead of going, you're actually going, or whatever the fuck it is.
British cinema had a great tradition of genre with Hammer and Amicus and Tygon and a lot of the kind of companies in the 50s, 60s, 70s. And then it mostly gone away in the 80s and 90s.
Or you had your kind of Hugh Grant type romantic comedy movies. Basically, horror was dead at the cinema at that point. You were kind of looked down upon, you know, like you were a second-class citizen working in a kind of slum sort of environment.
But really, in the past 10 years, there's been a real rebirth of the genre film, of all sorts, really.
There was a sudden wave of genre films came out, and that just seemed to, like, open the floodgates.
I think the re-emergence of genre filmmaking in England is probably most to do with the fact that the market recognises that those types of films, you know, have some monetary value and that they can be successful.
And of course, what tends to happen when that's the case is that genre suddenly goes.
I guess maybe the rebirth was triggered by a generation of film fans who grew up in the 70s and 80s, which was an amazing period for genre cinema, for American genre cinema in particularly. So I guess kids who grew up with Star Wars, with Raiders of the Lost Ark, Close Encounters.
Like, I'd grown up with the Spielberg and James Cameron and, you know, Paul Verhoeven and those kind of movies. And I think what's happened is there was a drought. And basically, all the people that got inspired to make films by, you know, the early genre movies in the 80s, I think now they're in a position of power and they are the filmmakers that are coming up.
The filmmakers now, they learnt film through film. They learnt it by just sitting down, watching The Evil Dead, on watching John Carpenter movies. One of the reasons is that these kind of directors, like Edgar Wright and Guy Ritchie and Joe Cornish, they're kind of raised on VHS, on videos.
You know, parents in the early 80s would let the VHS machine be the babysitter. I had seen Zombie Flesh Eaters and The Exorcist by the time I was 10 because there was no censorship. There was this fantastic period in the early 80s in the UK when the government were too slow to respond to this new technology. And as a result, for about 4 years, it was anything goes. It was open season. You would have an amazing variety of European movies, American movies, horror movies, you know, softcore porn movies, tiny micro-budget movies, big-budget movies. And then a lot of these films became sort of sensational because the government tried to ban them. There was a moral panic in the UK.
As a kid growing up in the 1980s, as a teenager, it meant that you wanted to see all these films that you were told were going to deprave and corrupt you.
a lot of misspent youth, which when they reported that misspent youth back in the day of the '83 when they banned all the video nasties, it was little did they know that there was going to be a whole generation of filmmakers that would bring a lot of jobs to the British economy and a lot of movies.
The big change, of course, was 1997. The Labour government came into power, and they then started thinking about how they could create a body, an institute that was going to be like in any other country. In France, it's the CNC, that was going to determine the cultural and commercial industrial policy for film, out of which came the UK Film Council, which was created in 2000 to combine a disparate group. You had the BFI, which was very much looking after the cultural and the film educational side. You had British Screen. You had the British Film Commission, that all came under one body called the UK Film Council. In addition, hugely importantly, there had been a lottery pot of money.
The National Lottery helped a lot of filmmakers find their feet. I mean, directors like Chris Smith, who's done Creep and movies like Severance, in that sense, that they could get boost to filmmakers who wanted to make commercial projects.
I think there definitely has been an evolution in the funding. And there's a big debate here. There's always a big debate here as how commercial, we had the Prime Minister saying you should fund commercial films. Now, of course, nobody really knows what a commercial film is.
For a long time, there was very little money. There was no cohesive thinking about what our cultural and industrial policy should be. And all of a sudden, we had a tax credit that was running for 10 years. So people could plan, right, what they were doing.
And I have a mixed feeling about that, because if you look at it, at the time of Shallow Grave, there was like 25 features being made. I suspect those 25 features were just as good as the 100 that are being made now. At that period, Trainspotting, Four Weddings, there was a sort of desperate need to express yourself for the audience. And I think that's the real thing that genre film's about, is that it's about people wanting to embrace an audience a little bit more.
When a different kind of person entered our industry, because some of the rules of how to get in there, you didn't have to do 20 years at the BBC before you got your first chance. It attracted a younger kind of people that were grown up with different types of films, seeing stuff much more. We were at some point called, right or wrong, sort of more the multiplex generation.
So tell me, Cameron, just tell me, because I'd like to know, what on earth could make you think we'd want to share a flat like this with someone like you? I mean, my first impressions, and they're rarely wrong, is that you have none of the qualities we normally seek from a prospective flatmate. Talking here about things like presence, charisma, style and charm, and I don't think we're asking too much. I don't think we're being unreasonable.
Something like Danny Boyle's Shallow Grave is the movie that kind of brought genre movies back into the British cinema.
I don't know what you're talking about.
He doesn't know, David.
I wanted to be a filmmaker. Very soon realised I wasn't going to be a film director, so I became a film producer, and I met a guy who wanted to be a screenwriter, but he was a doctor. He had the idea for Shallow Grave. We had a script. We met Channel 4. Unbelievably, they wanted to make it, and then we went out and met Danny Boyle, and that's how it sort of happened. When I made Shallow Grave, which was the first feature film I was involved in, there were very few genre films. There was very few films to say, this is what I want to do, it's going to be something like this.
It was this incredibly, and I remember the title sequence with the camera charging through the cobbled streets of Newtown and the pumping soundtrack, and thinking, Christ, you can make a film that's got real energy and drive and wit, and it can be in Britain.
Andrew MacDonald and Trainspotting, certainly they were changing the face of British cinema in a really positive way, giving a real breadth to the sort of films that were being made.
And then after that, I obviously had a very good relationship with Danny, and we made a bunch of films together, but we also had a relationship after Polygram with Fox Searchlight, which was run by an English guy, and we made 28 Days. And
Fight! Fight!
With 28 Days Later, he totally took the zombie film and put it in a British context and said, here we can make these films over here as well with as much craft and as much vigor as you can make in an American film.
They shot it on DV, like on really cheap cameras. And it wasn't like Blair Witch. It wasn't like, we will make it look cheap, you know what I mean? They shot it cheaply so they could have the creative freedom they needed to quickly grab things.
Hello?
When we were making 28 Days even, which was a total genre film, you know, a zombie film, even people we wanted to get as the sort of designer didn't want to do it because it was a zombie, you know. I certainly remember, you know, certain people's agents not being keen for them to be involved in it, thinking it's going to be second-rate in some way.
British filmmakers have taken their cue from Tarantino like that. They've seen the success of Tarantino, making films on a small budget, but using genres in interesting ways, breaking down the conventions, having fun with them. And I think that a lot of filmmakers, from Guy Ritchie to Edgar Wright, are using sort of Tarantino as an inspiration, just to kind of take a genre but not do the same old thing with it, just to let it fly a little bit.
And I think there's a few key films really that have attributed to that. I think Lock, Stock was a huge thing in terms of the gangster genre. That really rebirthed that.
Within a minute, Harry's lost his rag, reached out for the nearest thing at hand, which happened to be a 15-inch black rubber cock. He's then proceeded to batter poor Smithy to death with it.
In Britain, we've got a very unique, dark sensibility that is a mixture of both a very savage sense of violence married to a very dark sense of humour. And I think in genre films, those two things go hand in hand very well.
Yeah, we find it harder to take things seriously in this country. I don't quite know why. Maybe we're quite sort of cynical, a little bit miserable because of the climate. Find it hard to be sort of unironically positive about stuff because we know it's going to rain tomorrow, usually.
Shaun of the Dead, Hot Fuzz are very, actually, distinctly British. You couldn't they will never be made in America. It's not really French. And they are capturing a particular type of sort of zeitgeist and, you know, and it is to do with often quite relatively small incidents, but blowing them out of proportion by putting them with zombies or whatever else you know, in a bizarre society. But being incredibly dry and simple and simplistic almost about the characters and the characterizations and the things that they do.
We're very good at sort of self-deprecating. You know, we call it taking the piss out of ourselves, you know, and recognizing our own sort of faults in humor. And, you know, my favorite bit in Shaun of the Dead, when I realized that, you know, that it was total genius, is all those people commuting to work and not realizing that half the population are zombies. It's fantastic, you know, and you can't quite see that in American cinema.
No, I haven't got any change. I didn't even have enough at the fucking shop.
When we first started Shaun of the Dead, at the time that we first started trying to pitch it, nobody really, like, sort of gave a shit about zombies. Some people didn't even know what they were, and so it seemed like a kind of a bit of a, you know, dead genre. And weirdly, the only other film that was out there at the time that we were writing it was Danny Boyle was doing this zombie film. And I remember when I heard about that, I was so mad because I thought we were doing like the only British zombie film, and then I found out about 28 Days Later, and I was like, what? Oh, no! But it actually ended up being a good thing. I think if 28 Days Later hadn't been a hit, I don't think Shaun would have been as big a hit, because I think it helped kind of break ground in terms of there being another British zombie film out there. We had written the script as a sort of reaction against like the British comedies that we were seeing, which was mostly the kind of the romantic comedies, most of which were made by Working Title.
And the ultimate irony is that Working Title were the company that came in to save the day on Shaun of the Dead, which I would have never expected to happen. So without them, there would be no Shaun of the Dead.
Purple Rain. No. Sign of the Times. Definitely not. The Batman soundtrack.
Throw it.
Okay. Oh, Dire Straits. Throw it. Stone Roses. No. Second Coming. I like it. Sade. That's Liz's. Yeah, but she did dump you. Oh.
I definitely thought there was maybe like a way of doing a British comedy / genre film that like had those kind of quirks to them. One of the reasons that I wanted to direct that movie and write it with Simon is because there had been no British genre films for quite a long time, and we had an idea of how to do it in our own neighborhood and with ourselves essentially in it. Everybody felt like they knew those characters. It's like, oh, I know that guy, you know. So, in the States, people laughed at exactly the same jokes in Shaun of the Dead as they do here. And later that same kind of thought is what inspired Hot Fuzz, is that, you see all these big kind of police actioners with lots of guns in the States, and like it's something that just doesn't look right here and feels odd. So the idea of doing like a Michael Bay, Tony Scott kind of actioner in the English countryside.
Come on. Through the gardens. What's the matter, Danny? You never taken a shortcut before?
We don't really think of the films as parodies because they're very affectionate, and if anything, we're trying to make one of those movies, and in some cases it's because the characters are funny. Like in Shaun of the Dead, the zombies don't really do anything funny. It's more about the characters' reactions. In Hot Fuzz, it's seeing kind of like sort of cops in a sleepy town dreaming for something more, kind of deal with complete kind of chaos erupting.
Dear Lord. That was amazing. Thank you, Danny. Can't believe I shot someone.
He's a doctor, he can deal with it.
I never shot anyone before.
What British genre movies do is that they bring a kind of real-life element into genres. So the heroes, particularly somebody like Simon Pegg and Nick Frost, they're a bit crap, They're not macho men, they're not Tom Cruise, they're not Matt Damon. They bring a reality and a bumbliness and a comedy to these kind of things. So I think they're much more identifiable in some ways than certain US actors are.
There is a tradition in British films that social aspects, societal situations creep into British films. I think we certainly in Britain have a history of making films that speak of ill times or problems in society. And there are many filmmakers that have done that. But I think it's also prevalent in American cinema, probably to a lesser extent, because American cinema is about money, making money, and guns, and all of that. But which is not a bad thing. I mean, one of the things that excited me about the script for Harry Brown was that I felt that it was very much born of a time in Britain, or this time in Britain, which is not to say a particular year, but it's born out of problems that a whole generation of youth are having, or we're having, rather, with a generation of youth. So why is there so much violence in modern society generally at the moment? How it was born of very much of our times and problems we were having, and I was very interested in that because I am interested in politics, and I was interested in making a genre film that delivered a sort of a message, if you like, that had more to say. And there's a great tradition in Britain of doing that within filmmaking.
tell me what happened to Leonard?
Fuck off! Fucking hell!
You tell me the truth. I won't hurt you anymore.
Fuck off, alright? Fucking shit!
I was also very much aware with Harry Brown that I'd be probably making a film that was really going to divide opinion. I knew that. I could see that because it was going to upset a lot of people. It was going to upset the status quo, as we call it here. There were a lot of people who like the way our country is and what it offers, and I do too, but there is much to our country which needs to change and to develop and needs to take note of what's coming up in the youth. Why did we have the most horrendous riots very recently in Britain? Why? Because there are so many social problems. We have so much bubbling underneath, and hopefully it won't, but I would not be surprised if it happened again.
Take it.
Man, look!
Attack the Block has an element of social commentary in it. It starts with these kids doing a bad thing. They mug a woman, and then that sets in motion this series of events, this alien invasion, and then they kind of learn about the consequences of their actions because of what they do. They end up having to team up with the woman they mugged. So there's an element of social satire. I like movies about teen rebellion, and I like, when you're that age, you're half an arsehole and half a genius. And I wanted to show that in the film, you know. And also I wanted to try and redress the balance that a lot of British films present kids like that as sort of irredeemable and evil and monstrous and bestial. So we took all the adjectives people used to describe those kids, turned that into a monster, set the monster against the kids in order to bring out the humanity of the kids. That was the idea. The idea for Attack the Block came from my love of sci-fi that mixed up fantasy and reality. I wanted to see a science fiction story told in South London, which is where I grew up. And also it came out of me being mugged in a similar situation to the film and finding the situation very artificial, kind of almost like a scene from a movie.
Easy kill.
We knew we didn't have much money for special effects, for CGI, and it's a creature movie where these monsters are running around, so I figured I had to come up with a clever, different way of executing the monsters. And I'm very into comic books and anime, and I was thinking of the whole film as if it was a comic strip. I came up with the idea of a creature that was a silhouette. So I thought that would be a cool idea to have this creature with further absorbed light rather than reflected it. So our creatures were sort of nothingness, and we tried to make an asset out of not having a huge amount of resources. Attack the Block is a movie about a gang fighting aliens. It's very simple. You know, Shaun of the Dead is about, you know, slackers fighting zombies. You know, moon and monsters. They're ideas that you can understand quite easily.
But I think that genre film is sort of mistaken a lot as not being individual. But, you know, as you make Shaun of the Dead or Attack the Block, you can say a lot more, I've always thought that, about the society you're living in than you can with, you know, some coming-of-age story, which is always the story. Not that there's anything wrong with coming-of-age stories, we just have made a lot of them in Britain.
Genre also it's from the imagination, and I like the real world. I can see the real world anyway, it's just outside the window. Recreating the world in an imaginative context, you know, horror, fantasy, sci-fi, to me that brings the power of the imagination to it. So if there's a bit of a rebel spirit, I think it's also to bring that independent kind of thing about wanting to make a film of the fantastic.
From the outside, from the world of people who don't like genre, they tend to look in and think it's very subversive and think they're people who just like violence or just hate and want to rage and make a point. Whereas I actually think it's a very different reason. I think that the vast majority of genre work has a very almost sort of Judeo-Christian sensibility about it, the challenging of taboos to say this is wrong. The way we think in society is this is unacceptable to behave like that.
Fetch! Make the shot!
What I wanted to do as a first movie, and I wanted to do a siege movie because I really liked Rio Bravo and I really liked Assault on Precinct 13 and Zulu. And then the idea of basically soldiers versus werewolves just came into my head. It was just like, okay, soldiers versus werewolves, I like that. And not to do a werewolf film that was all about, you know, the curse of the werewolf and how awful it was to be a werewolf. Every single werewolf film is about that. The struggles of the man fighting back the inner beast and all that kind of thing. I just thought, what if the werewolves are the enemy? They're just out there. They're werewolves, and our guys are fighting them. And you know, you shoot them, they don't die. You need silver bullets. You need whatever. And I thought it was a new take on the werewolf genre that hadn't been done before. So it was just really throwing every idea that I had into the same pot and coming up with Dog Soldiers.
Filmmakers are rebelling against the British sort of history of cinema, where we've been usually about period movies. We've been or about kind of rom-coms
and misery. Any kind of drug abuse, wife beating. So yeah, I guess it is a tiny bit rebellious to make a genre film in this country.
But you've got to kind of go, actually, I'm going to be a little punk about it, because the movies that we watched at the time I always got a sense for those video nasties from the 80s were made by these degenerate, kind of twisted punk guys, which they were.
The punk analogy is really interesting, because if you look at the punk bands, behind them was like Malcolm McLaren and those geniuses who were really making the money, and those guys sort of were just swept along. I think whilst there is that kind of quite exciting anti-establishment thing with the filmmakers now,
I don't think it's necessarily a punk aesthetic. I think it just comes from people telling you, no, you can't do that film. We don't want to do that film, or nobody wants to see that film, and you know in your gut. That's where the punk element comes in, is because it's just a fight to get a film made, to get any film made.
Well, put it this way, I think you end up being having that punk attitude whether you like it or not when you make genre films, because you are going against the grain. You're trying to do stuff often with effects, stuff that's a bit more stylized and fantastic than usual. So you're immediately out of the mainstream, I guess. But I don't think you necessarily have to have crazy hair or listen to that music or spit at people.
So you've got to try and keep that madness in you if you want to keep being on the cutting edge. Gaspar Noé is a punk director that I love. Werner Herzog's a punk director. Abel Ferrara's a punk director. And all these directors are kind of guys that are just a little nuts. And they put that nuts, they're not nuts in themselves, but they put that nuts on the screen. And I think that horror directors have an obligation to be a little bit nuts. The original idea for Creep came from when I first saw American Werewolf in London, and way back as a teenager, and saw that tube sequence. And I remember thinking at the time, it's one of my favourite moments in that, why hasn't anyone made a horror movie on the underground? I just felt that there's something nice and contained, and horror movies that have a very contained idea are often, I think, the best, when they're all set in, like The Exorcist is all set in someone's front room, or the Alien is on a spaceship, or the Shining's in a hotel. I think it really gives you a good sense of containment. Of all the films I've made, whenever I'm at a film festival, everybody comes up to me and gives me Creep to sign, and it's kind of weird that people always come back to that. I sort of say, oh yeah, have you seen Black Death? No. Have you seen Triangle? No. Severance? I think I have. Seen Creep? And they go, Creep? You made Creep? I was like, yeah. So it's kind of, I shouldn't complain, but it's a movie that everyone grew up with, I know, it's kind of mad. It just tries to be scary, and I think that's what people respond to, I think. I think that's the key, really, to make a good horror movie. I just want to go back to making something that's just really scary. I just made Creep. We were in Cannes, and I just saw this big ocean liner parked up on the thing, and I said to the producer, I said, we should make a movie set on a ship, because that would be cool. We could park it off of Bermuda, and we can, it'd be much more fun than being in the London Underground. And literally on the spot, when we were having a few beers, I said, what happens if a boat arrives, and you see someone on the deck, and the person looking back is that person? And, a kind of doppelganger movie. And that idea so obsessed me. I thought, well, is that the end of a movie? I thought, well, I can't end the movie like that, because then it's a Twilight Zone episode, and it just year after year I was writing it until eventually it became this absolute film that deals with insanity, but liked the idea of the triangle, the idea of a glitch in time, and the idea of being trapped in time. What I love about Triangle is it has three really clear levels of, on the one hand, it's a ghost story going to a boat. On the other hand, it's a breakdown movie. And on the other side is she dead? Is she not dead?
Critically, we had filmmakers like Ken Loach and Mike Leigh in Britain who were very well critically respected and sort of very well liked by critics. And the genre movies less so. But I think, these days we have sort of very intelligent filmmakers working within genre.
I think critics need to kind of open their eyes to that kind of stuff, that they have to take it more seriously, because it's a bit slow in coming. It's like when you think about some of the great genre films, Exorcist or whatever, it's just like nearly 40 years old. So it's like, how could critics not take this stuff seriously?
And interestingly, one of the reasons I believe critics treat both broad comedy and genre horror very unfairly, they're very dismissive of them both, is that those films do not rely on the critics. It castrates them completely, because as a horror fan, if somebody says to me, you got to see this film, it's a piece of shit, but there's a jump in it that you will not believe, I will pay my £15, as will every other horror fan. I think that is also changing, because a lot of our generation, the fanboys, are now growing up and becoming the people who do the reviews. So I think there is definitely a world.
I don't know. What do you mean you don't know? There's no breeze. It could be any one of these tunnels. Take your pick. Oh, fuck it. Hello! Please. Is there anybody there? Hello!
A lot of what happened with Descent was in kind of direct response to Dog Soldiers. That some critic in the UK basically said that, it's great to see a British genre action werewolf movie or whatever, but it's also played for laughs. And when will a British filmmaker make a really scary movie again? And I should go and set out to make the most terrifying movie I possibly can think of. When I came up with the concept for Descent, it was originally going to be a mixed group. At some point, we came up with the idea of what if it was all women? And I was like, that's it's a genius idea, and it makes so much sense. It's like, because I'd done my research into climbers and cavers and such like, and there are so many women who are doing that now that it made sense. In this day and age, why not? Why not have it all women? And I thought, well, nobody's done an action horror film that's an entirely female cast before, so that's something fresh, and to treat them in such a way that isn't they're not just running around in their underwear all the time, to treat them with a degree of respect. So
since the films of the roughies of the 60s and then the kind of misogynist horror films in the 70s and 80s, I think that women felt quite uncomfortable watching those a lot of the time, because they saw themselves as being pretty much placed as in victim roles. But I do think from, kind of like the 90s through to now, you've had a much stronger tip towards there being very fierce female characters. Often, even if they're the bad guy, like if they're the evil characters, they still have like a lot of like personality and force.
Horror movies are a bit like football, I think. When I was a kid growing up, just boys watched them, and now since David Beckham, boys and girls watch them. And when you go to a football match, it's a much bigger spread of people. And I think that's the same with horror movies. I think watching horror movies for girls has become a ride that they want to be part of.
Doghouse is something which can be a bit divisive because we were looking for something different to do within zombie films, which is quite tricky because you think most things have been done. And, we had the usual thing that there was some kind of military virus, something which had kicked it off. But we love the idea that the virus would affect one gender, basically. It was because we thought that we could get more mileage out of the guys being attacked by women. But really, we were looking at the way that males and male bonding, that men try and deal with the fact that they basically don't know how to cope with women.
Lovely little thing, ain't you, sweetheart? You lovely, ain't you? Hey? Whoa, whoa. Vince, go have a bang on this, mate. Just have a bang on that. Bollocks! Oh, well done.
Horror movies give first-time filmmakers, even historically, a chance to make a film, because if you're an investor and you give £1 million into a project, you can see pretty quickly whether it's probably going to be scary, whether there's jumps, whether there's blood, which is a much easier thing to keep an eye on as an investor than if someone's making a great kind of art house searing drama that you need that only the vision of the auteur at the end works.
I have found in the last 2 or 3 years it very difficult to get projects financed if they don't comfortably fit in to the sort of subject matters that people might recognise obviously as being commercially successful. So, for example, if you had a film that was of a similar ilk to a film that had been very successful for some reason, if you said, well, my film's going to be a bit like that film, then you're more likely, I think, to be able to get the money for it. And it's more difficult to raise capital for films unless you have a named star attached to it. And more than ever, it's about casting now, who you have in your film. For example, if I had a really dull script that wasn't very exciting, but I had Liam Neeson in it, I'm going to get the money to make it like that.
Look at me. Oh, yeah.
As to whether Harry Brown could have been made without Michael Caine, I would say that I very much doubt that. I think it's the kind of role that needs someone of that stature to play it. It also needed someone of that stature to get the film financed.
I actually went to the production company and said, I want to make a monster movie, but I'm not sure what it's about. I just want to do a monster movie, and I think we could do one really cheaply. They were like, great, because they saw the dollar signs, and they didn't care either what it was about. It was like, let's figure it out together. And it slowly evolved into like kind of a love story, because I wanted to do something quite serious as a character piece, but was set in a world with monsters. And I think if I'd come to them and said, I want to do a love story, and I want to do this relationship drama that's kind of like a road movie, I think they would have been like, yeah, we'll think about it.
Are you sure it's dead?
Yeah, it's dead. I think another thing that's changed the landscape of all this has got to be digital effects. If we hadn't had the invention of, the development of computer graphics, I don't think this would be happening. And so it actually helped me when I showed film producers my work and said, I think we can do this really cheaply. That was all done from my bedroom. Please, can we just make a movie? We'll spend as little as possible. All that ever worries the producers is it doesn't matter how much they cost because they can be done very cheaply, but we've got to spend money to sell this thing, and we're going to have to put posters up, and we're going to have to do marketing, and that costs millions sometimes, no matter what the movie cost. But with genre, there's this proven business model, because there's such an appetite for it from fans and everybody, you've got much more higher chance of success, so it's much less risk for them.
It's a business. Someone's going to make money, so you might as well think about making the money, because if you don't, they will make it and sell it for you. And I think that that's been one of the failings of British cinema for a long time, is that it's been a complete lack of commercial sense.
And also, I make films. You've got English-speaking films like this, 85% is American, 15% is British, and then of that 15% you have James Bond, Harry. So I'm left with like 2 or 3%, and I'm trying to, but I desperately want my films to be shown in the mainstream. And a lot of that's about finding the right partners to distribute those films as well as make them. Making the film is never as hard as getting it seen. I think if anything about DNA films and all the films I've made is trying to make British films that have some presence in the rest of the world. Like everybody else, I'm sitting here hoping that the new Chinese middle class have a love of British cinema. But
the big problem that we have here in the UK for producers is that, unlike in France and in some other European countries, we don't really have quite as much direct or legal access to some of the revenue streams that come into our films. And it's kind of odd, because actually, if there were more of those vertically integrated entities and there was sufficient capital, you could possibly think that we could make those things ourselves and be very successful, and not just have to go to Hollywood and, you know, lay our egg there.
If you're making a $20 or $30 million movie, you can make that here. If you're making a $100 million movie, it's very hard to make it here. You can make it, you know, with companies like Working Title, you could perhaps, you can do it and you can have that support. But it's a much tougher thing. The American landscape is much more geared to the bigger film.
We have a lot of UK talent that, you know, from Edgar Wright to Joe Cornish to Stephen Moffat, who will go to Hollywood, in part because it's a big industry, okay? If you want to work consistently and work with the best writers, the best directors, and the best cast, then that's where still is the hub, and you get paid extremely well for doing it.
So, you know, Hollywood sees the talent and goes, shroom, come and do something here. You know, create the same buzz or excitement. And when that really works, it really works brilliantly, because unique take with limitless money. When it doesn't work is, here's limitless money, you better fucking do what we say, and you can't quite do it the way you wanted it because it's all our money.
The cliche is that director goes to Hollywood, gets kind of swallowed up, comes back. But I don't think that's necessarily true. It all depends on what the films you want to make are, whether you generate them yourself, what films you're comfortable making, kind of like how much of a voice you have anyway.
It's very clear. It's like if you make a film in the Hollywood system from a career point of view, and the film is artistically dismal and critically slaughtered, but that film makes money, you have a career. You will make more films. You're signing up to the John Ford approach of making films, which is you shoot the movie and you're lucky if you're in the edit. And you go on and you make your next film and you shoot that. And I think as long as you make those people in the studios feel comfortable that you're doing the right thing, and you're making a film that they can sell, then the decisions you make as a storyteller or as a filmmaker should be yours. And I think as long as they have the comfort and the sense of trust, they'll let you do that. Danny Boyle actually was very helpful in advice for getting this job. I already morally didn't want to work with performing chimps, but practically he advised against it as well after his experience. But we talked about that, and he gave me a lot of great advice about managing the studio system. And, you know, I got hammered in pre-production by my studio, and by that I mean, you know, I was very, very closely monitored. By my producers, by the studio, by everyone, and I found it really hard going. And I would say that the second day of shooting, it was like this weight lifted off me, and they started to see dailies, and they started to realize that I could be left alone. Either that, or they had other bigger fish to fry. I don't know, but you know, we don't always agree. Of course, we don't. But at least we can communicate.
I think what they're doing is they're buying into a freshness of the film you've made, or a take or a spin on the film you've made, more than they are thinking that because you're British that'll make an impact. That's my personal opinion. And if you look at Duncan Jones, for example, I think that he got to do Source Code because they liked Moon.
There's no language barrier at all if you got a British filmmaker and you took them to Hollywood. And also there's this sort of strange history of, if you look at movies, all the intelligent characters tend to have British accents, and the bad guys have British accents. But having a British accent makes you seem twice as clever as you are to Americans. And so that doubles your value straight away. And so I just recommend everyone learn how to speak in a British accent and you'll be fine. It's that easy.
Horror has always been a testing ground for new actors and actors on the way up. It's catching those guys before they break is the discipline. And I think Michael Fassbender was in Eden Lake. So once they've done a couple of movies like that, they break, they're going to be in the States. But I always say fair play to them for going there and get on with it. I mean, he's in Prometheus now. It's going to be very hard to sort of pull him back and put him in another indie horror movie.
Michael Fassbender really had to show that he was a film star before getting hired in the States. Same thing with Daniel Craig. I mean, Daniel Craig had the whole Bond, transition, which helped them majorly to show, because it really showed him in a different light. And the thing that both these actors have that is very, very fascinating is they're both very strong leads, but fragile. So in terms of the storytelling, it always adds other layers. There's also another thing that, the UK agents that represent all this talent are much more in touch with the American studios than any other agent in any other part of the world. So you can have somebody make a short here, even just a short, and executives at studios in the States will know about it.
What I find amazing is that Hollywood time and time again turns to Britain in ways that we could never sort of think about. And, even Game of Thrones is it's such a British sort of thing, and you could argue, obviously, Titanic and Harry Potter, which is really American, and the way they did it, and Lion, the Witch, and the Witch. There's so many, Lord of the Rings, they're all so British, and somehow those are the things we don't quite able to pull off.
A lot of British directors that go to Hollywood get eaten up and spat out by the machine, and used and abused and ignored. And if you're lucky, then you can get through and go on and ultimately go, now I can make the films I want to make. Because it's a machine in America and it's about making money. And that's what it's about, and nothing else.
It's the UK distributors that realise, just like a UK broadcaster realised, you can always buy great American films, and some of them are fantastic. But audiences also want to see things that are recognisable, that happen directly, that they can relate to, that are in their backyards, that are here, that they understand.
The biggest success recently in genre films is Woman in Black. It's one of the highest grossing horror films in the UK ever. It's sold everywhere internationally. It worked really well. In the States, it did over $50 million. That, successes like that will help everybody else doing genre films.
No, with Woman in Black, I was sent Jane Goldman's screenplay, and I read the screenplay and I loved the script, and I thought there was a real potential to make a really interesting, really scary film that was very cinematic, very spare, very little dialogue, very stripped back, very visual.
Look at Woman in Black. It's actually it's a really simple story. It's a house, one person, and a woman in the attic kind of thing. That's sort of it. And then the things that are being scary are being created out of not a lot. We're unlikely to come and deliver this because we're going to go and compete and do 225,000 explosions, or we're going to do hundreds of special effects.
I've seen a lot of American horror films where the sound design becomes very bombastic and really it sort of forces you back. And here we very much wanted the sense of having the audience sort of constantly leaning in and not quite, both in terms of the imagery, what is that? What did I just see? What's on the edge of the frame? What's in the blacks? but also kind of listening in the sound design, you half-heard sounds that's pulling you in, and then occasionally there'll be something that throws you back in your chair.
If you're a film geek, I think The Return of Hammer is just the most exciting thing. And I thought The Woman in Black is a really strong movie. Just very creepy in a very subtle way. And if it means the return of girls with big breasts running around getting stabbed, then that's a great thing as well.
Because it was such a big part of our childhood, you know. Maybe the only thing really in the early 80s that was on TV was the Hammer House of Horror. And that was a huge thing. That was like the last great British genre television show.
British TV is engaging with genre much more now than probably it ever has. I think, you know, from science fiction, through Torchwood and Doctor Who, obviously, and through lots of different crime dramas. We've always been into crime. We haven't really done much horror on TV yet. So that's the kind of thing we should look at.
There's something about British people that's quite realistic and cynical, and so we quite like it to be a bit shoddy and homemade and low budget. We like the wobbly sets in Doctor Who. We like, you know, the tinfoil costumes. We're suspicious of the big expensive stuff.
I think television has a really good function for cinema. It keeps cinema on its toes. Rather than just say, let's make a film, and if it's really successful, let's see if we can turn it into a TV series, right? Which is how it used to be. Now you've got a certain style of very desirable television series, and the filmmakers have to really think about what it is that they're offering that's unique enough for people to want to go and watch their film. And I think that's a very healthy balance, and I like it. And there used to be snobbery. If you were in television, well, that was sort of over down there, and film was high art. All of those walls are being broken down, and I think there's much more crossover both ways, from filmmakers that want to work in television and lots of really experienced and skilled people in television who can work in film.
I think now, for me, I'm really interested in television because, you know, should I have tried to make The Walking Dead rather than 28 weeks later? You know, it's really interesting, that television series. It's a fantastic series, but I don't think British television has caught up as fast as it will. I think you'll see that happen now because I don't think they've quite exploited the genre thing as cleverly. I suspect there's more to come.
The future of genre films in Britain has got to be bloody, hasn't it? You know, the social landscape with the euro going to the wall and the whole kind of like economic climate fucking up. I think that's probably could be very good for horror films.
So I very much hope there'll be more genre cinema, and I hope, you know, there'll be maybe less grim, depressing stories and less films about royalty, and more stuff with a bit of imagination and creativity and fantasy and escapism. You know, you don't have to let go of that stuff. You can carry on doing it until, you know, until you die.